Our next speaker is Dr. Yarcia. He's a lawyer and a physician advocating for public health and human rights. Presently, Dr. Lee serves as the Senior Policy and Law Reform Officer of NoBox Philippines. He's also a professorial lecturer at the UP College of Law and a special lecturer at the UP College of Medicine. Dr. Lee's special field of interest includes legal history, medical jurisprudence, and public health law. Dr. Lee, please.
Thank you very much, Arline. Thank you also, Dr. Juan, for that wonderful presentation. Magandang araw po sa inyong lahat. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm honored to be in your company today as I believe that this is a gathering of kindred souls who care about people who use drugs and who believe that we can be better as a society when it comes to building supportive communities. My presentation for today is entitled Harm Reduction as Kindness, simply put, a whole of society for people involved with drugs. I want to begin my presentation with a story from the book Sophie's World by the Norwegian intellectual and author Jostein Gaarder. In this story, the captain was explaining to Sophie how certain conditions in the human mind contribute to our conception of the world. The captain asked Sophie to wear glasses with red lenses. When Sophie put on the glasses, everything around her became red. The captain then asked, "What do you see?" Sophie responded and said, "I see exactly the same as before, except that it's all red." The captain then remarked, "That's because the glasses limit the way you perceive reality. Everything you see is part of the world around you, but how you see it is determined by the glasses you are wearing. So you cannot say the world is red, even though you conceive it as being so." The way we view the world is limited by the size of the frames we use to look at the world. The image, it may just appear to be a rooster comb, but if we enlarge our frames, the bigger picture can be the head of a rooster, or maybe a room with two kids, or a picture maybe that of a big farm. Our work in communities is to get as close to the truth as possible by hearing the voices of people involved with drugs, who should be at the center of supportive communities we are building. So, what is the big picture when it comes to people involved with drugs? We know from our study of legal history that psychoactive substance use plays a meaningful role in the lives of people. Early Spanish accounts narrate that indigenous Filipinos practiced chewing areca nut mixed with lime and wrapped with betel leaves for its mood-altering and psychoactive effects. And this practice was so widespread that the Venetian historian Antonio Pigafetta took note of the reddish tinge of the teeth of the Filipino natives. Substance use plays a cultural role, and offering a tray of areca nut was considered the essence of urbanity, an act of courtesy and politeness in every house. Chapter 1 of Jose Rizal's Noli Me Tangere tells the story of the guests of Capitan Tiago being offered buyo or betel nut to welcome them in the host's house. Now, during the 19th century, after the abolition of the galleon trade and Mexico's Declaration of Independence, the Philippines was introduced to world commerce and needed more labor support from the Chinese, who were known to be persons who use opium. There isn't much documented use among Filipinos, but opium use was ubiquitous in Chinese communities, and people from all walks of life, be they mandarins, workers, merchants, servants, nuns, and priests, smoked opium. The Spanish government regulated opium through a monopolio, which allowed the Chinese to use opium, but prohibited Filipinos from using the same for issues related to morality. So when we're looking at legal history, we try to understand what are the motivations, what are the reasons, what's the context of substance use. And that's an important aspect of our understanding of drug use. Alcohol, for example, is an important psychoactive substance, and it has a rich tradition in the Philippines and fulfills social and political functions. When you talk about Filipino feasts, they're understood not so much as eating, but they're more understood as drinking alcohol. In fact, drinking alcohol mixed with blood between the rulers is understood as a means of forging political alliances in a ritual known as sanduko. So these cultural, economic, and social dimensions of substance use still exist today. In our recent 2018 ethnography work in an urban community in Metro Manila, we found that drug use figures in the everyday lives of the Filipino people. For example, methamphetamine acts as pampagilas or pampagising for workers, helping people feel more energetic and alert as people work for night or for long hours. People prefer to use the performance enhancer shabu given an economic setting where manual labor is the main capital for low-income families. We also noted social functions for other substances such as marijuana, which enhances merrymaking during social gatherings of young individuals and serves the same role as alcohol in drinking or inuman sessions. Many other historical and ethnographic studies confirm that substance use exists among Filipinos, and the context of use varies depending on the cultural, social, and economic factors. According to the latest world data on the prevalence of drug use from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crimes, an estimated 269 million people aged 15 to 64 have used drugs at least once a year. And this roughly translates to 1 in every 19 people using psychoactive drugs. Out of 269 million people, 35.6 million are estimated to have drug use that is harmful or are experiencing drug dependence and or require treatment. Stated otherwise, about 87% of people who use drugs do not have a pattern of drug use, which is harmful, nor are they experiencing any drug dependence and or requiring treatment. In 2016, the UNODC found that the connection between drugs and violence is not an automatic one. The UNODC World Drug Report also shows that drugs do not have the same association with violent crimes compared with alcohol, a substance that is culturally, socially, and economically acceptable in various jurisdictions. Which brings us to where we are at now today. What do we know from looking at the history and the lived realities of people involved with drugs? We now realize that the old lens colors the way we look at drugs. We have grown up being told that drug use is simply harmful, that drug use is always bad, and to just say no to drugs. The new lens directs us to look at the context of drug use and to unpack the underlying issues and to understand the whys behind drug use. Because only then can we understand the big picture behind drug use. And it is through this understanding that we'll be able to know the next step. How can we help? How can we make sure that our communities are not just well and safe, but thriving and conducive for living a good life? I'd like to echo the philosophy and framework that brought us all here together today: harm reduction. Harm reduction refers to policies, programs, and practices that aims primarily to reduce the adverse health, social, and economic consequences of the problematic use of legal and illegal psychoactive drugs without focusing on drug consumption alone. The focus of harm reduction, as the term suggests, is to primarily reduce harms associated with drug use. It would be prudent to first highlight that the fact primarily means that it focuses on reducing the adverse consequences. And these adverse consequences, the priority is to keep people alive, to keep people safe, and to make sure that they are well taken care of. This has to be emphasized because there's a tendency for some frameworks and some policymakers to forget the basic presumption that for any community work that we will do, the first principle is to make sure that people are alive, safe, and well. The wording and the definition of harm reduction is phrased in the negative, to reduce adverse consequences, implying that engaging in any human behavior or activity it may carry risks, whether big or small. And the prudent and pragmatic approach is to minimize these consequences. While the definition does suggest that reducing adverse consequences is the key objective, it nevertheless embraces other purposes that are positively phrased, such as promoting health, social well being of people who use drugs and their communities. Harm reduction makes specific reference to health, social, and economic factors. Now, this stresses a paradigm shift. We're moving away from the perspective that drug use is a crime or a moral failing. And we now adopt that reality, wherein drug use is a complex and multifaceted behavior shaped by the context of the individual and is therefore unique in each case. And as an implication, when we talk about whole of society approach, we talk about the whole gamut of health, social, and economic responses related to drug use. Another important distinction that has to be made is unpacking the definition of drug use in its effect to person and the community. There's an old perception that drug use is always problematic, and this has to be removed. We now make a distinction between problematic and non-problematic drug use. And harm reduction is focused on addressing problematic issues so that we can create real solutions for people who use drugs. In fact, much of the problems associated with drug use today are actually brought by that wrong notion that we always have to intervene and always have to create responses for drug use, even the non-problematic ones, such as, for example, the compulsory detention in rehabilitation center, mandatory drug testing, incarceration, and even the war on drugs. These are under the assumption that drug use will always be problematic. The working definition makes reference to legal and illegal psychoactive drugs. Reading through the entire phrasing, drugs are only but one of the different factors in harm reduction. The current perspective is most preoccupied with drugs per se, as if it's the most important determinant in policy development. That should not be the case. Drugs are merely part of the context of an individual, and its effect varies depending on the person who uses them and the setting in which he or she lives in. The important point here to remember is that it has never been about drugs, but it has always been about people. Finally, harm reduction breaks the old notion that abstinence is the sole and primordial goal of the whole of society approach. Harm reduction does not focus on drug consumption alone. It could be a goal in case where a person who uses drugs would have defined it as their goal. But harm reduction is inclusive, and it respects the process of the individual, respects autonomy, control, and personhood of an individual, and the informed decision of that person who used drugs. The definition reflects empiric data that a drug-free society is unrealistic, and forcing abstinence to people who use drugs is inhumane. Harm reduction stands on the lived realities of people who use drugs and provides support, whether that person uses drugs or decides to stop using drugs. This is harm reduction. It is about going back to the fundamental basics of our humanity. The Filipino community is known for its pakikipagkapwa, for its bayanihan spirit, for its sense of community. And harm reduction echoes these values, as it is simply put, kindness. It is giving voice to people involved with drugs as the main builders and the main drivers for a genuine whole of society approach. I mentioned the broad principles underpinning harm reduction, and I hope that you continue listening in our sessions to know more about best practices, more about specific examples, and see how we can really implement harm reduction in the communities that we work in. And hopefully, we can help change people's lives. Thank you very much. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, or Lee. Hindi. Thank you for emphasizing the importance of historical, cultural, and economic factors in understanding the complex context and factors of drug use, and for people to reflect on the lenses and frames that we use on how we view drugs and the people who use it, and to shift these views and frames and paradigms toward a more humane and evidence-based responses. So thank you.